The fluorescent lights of Lincoln Elementary's cafeteria hummed their usual monotonous song, casting harsh shadows across rows of folding chairs where parents sat stiffly in their Sunday best. Connor Matthews slumped in his seat, feeling his cheeks burn, as Mrs. Pemberton's voice sliced through the murmur of conversations like a blade through silk. "Perhaps if your father could tear himself away from his couch long enough to attend these conferences, you might actually apply yourself," she announced, her words dripping with contempt that made nearby parents shift uncomfortably. The 11-year-old's fingers curled into fists beneath the table, nails digging into palms. But he'd learned long ago that defending his dad only made teachers like her twist the knife deeper. Outside, 3 black vans rolled silently into the parking lot, their headlights extinguished, their occupants checking weapons with practiced efficiency that spoke of desperation rather than professionalism. The cafeteria doors burst open with a crash that shattered, the awkward tension like a brick through stained glass. Masked figures flooded in, their boots thundering against linoleum as parents screamed and chairs toppled in the chaos of bodies diving for cover. "Everyone down now!" The lead gunman's voice cracked with nervous energy, his weapons sweeping across the room in jerky, unpredictable arcs that made Connor's stomach drop. Mrs. Pemberton stumbled backward, her carefully composed superiority melting into raw terror as the reality of duct tape and zip ties replaced her orderly world of grade books and condescension. "Phones on the floor, wallets out. This school's about to fund our retirement," another captor snarled, kicking a purse across the room. Connor's hand moved slowly to his pocket, fingers finding the small device his father had pressed into his palm weeks ago with whispered instructions he'd never expected to use. "Your deadbeat dad isn't coming to save you now, is he, Connor?" Mrs. Pemberton's voice trembled despite her cruel words, fear making her grasp at familiar weapons of mockery, even as armed criminals circled like sharks. The boy met her eyes with an expression far too calm for a child surrounded by guns and panic, his thumb pressing the hidden button 3 times in rapid succession. "He'll come," Connor whispered, his voice steady in a way that made the teacher's sneer falter. The device sent its silent scream into the night, a digital flare visible only to someone who'd spent 20 years responding to emergencies in places where help never arrived in time. Outside, police sirens began their distant wail, growing closer with each passing second, but Connor knew his father would reach him first, not because he was closest, but because stopping was never an option. Men like his dad understood. The gang leader grabbed Connor by the collar, dragging him forward as a human shield, while Mrs. Pemberton finally understood that her carefully constructed judgments were about to collide with a reality she'd never bothered to imagine. "Let's see how much this town values its precious children," the criminal growled into a phone, his desperation palpable in every syllable. Above them, in the darkness of the ventilation system, something moved with the patient silence of a predator who'd spent years learning that the loudest entrance was rarely the most effective. Connor's lips curved into the faintest smile, his father's words echoing in his memory. "When things get dark, son, remember, the cavalry doesn't always announce itself with trumpets." The lead gunman's hand trembled as he pressed the cold barrel against Connor's temple, but the boy's breathing remained measured, controlled, exactly as his father had taught him during countless evenings in their basement where other kids' dads kept pool tables. "You think you're brave, kid?" the criminal hissed, his desperation bleeding through the bravado like ink through wet paper. Connor's fingers released the emergency device, letting it slip deeper into his pocket where no searching hands would find it. And when he spoke, his voice carried a certainty that made even Mrs. Pemberton stop her whimpering. "My dad's already on his way, but he won't knock on the door like the police outside." The words hung in the air like smoke, and something in the child's unflinching gaze made the gunman's grip loosen just enough to reveal his own fear. Around them, parents clutched their children tighter, their eyes fixed on the strange, calm boy who spoke of rescue as though it were already written in stone rather than prayer. Mrs. Pemberton found her voice again, her need to diminish Connor outweighing even her terror in a display of psychological armor so thick it had become her prison. His father is a nobody, a dropout who can't hold a job. You're wasting your concern on fantasies from a child who lives in delusion because reality is too painful. She spat, her words seeking to wound, even as her mascara ran in black rivers down her cheeks. Connor turned to face her fully, and for the first time in 3 years of her classes, he smiled at his teacher with something approaching pity. You're right about one thing, Mrs. Pemberton. My dad doesn't work a regular job anymore, and reality is painful, but not the way you think. His small hand gestured toward the ventilation grate above them, where a shadow had appeared so subtly that only someone looking for it would notice. The temperature in the room seemed to drop as Connor continued, his voice carrying a weight that silenced even the criminals' nervous chatter. The gang leader followed Connor's gaze upward, his weapons swinging toward the ceiling as paranoia finally caught up with poor planning. But the grate remained motionless, betraying nothing. "Shut that kid up before I do it permanently," he barked at his associates, though his voice cracked on the final word, revealing the amateur beneath the mask. Connor's father had always said that true operators moved between the seconds of awareness, in the blind spots of attention, where fear made people look everywhere except the right place. The boy's signal had done more than call for help. It had activated a tracking beacon that had told his father exactly where he sat, exactly how many hostages surrounded him, exactly what kind of men held them. Mrs. Pemberton watched Connor with growing unease, her certainty beginning to crack as she recognized something in his composure that her years of teaching had never prepared her to understand. Outside, police negotiators established their perimeter, their voices crackling through bullhorns with scripted reassurances, but Connor barely heard them because he was counting seconds in his head the way his father had taught him. 23 seconds since activation meant his dad had already cleared the outer building. 45 seconds meant entry through the maintenance corridor. 60 seconds meant positioning in the crawl spaces that janitors used and administrators forgot existed. The other hostages saw a child in danger, but Connor felt his father's presence like a change in air pressure before a storm, that peculiar awareness that came from being someone's entire world after a mother's cancer had rewritten their family's story 3 years prior. "He's here," Connor whispered, not to Mrs. Pemberton or the criminals, but to himself, a confirmation of faith in the one constant his young life had known. Above them, the ventilation grate shifted 1 millimeter, invisible to everyone except a boy who'd spent countless hours watching his father move through. Their house with the unconscious grace of someone trained to become a ghost. The gang leader's patience evaporated like morning dew under a blowtorch as red and blue lights painted the classroom walls in stuttering patterns that made shadows dance like demons at a funeral. "Tell them to back off, or I start sending out bodies, starting with the rich ones," he screamed toward the windows, his weapon tracking wildly across the crowd of huddled parents whose designer clothes and luxury watches suddenly meant nothing in the economy of survival. Mrs. Pemberton pressed herself against the wall, her carefully constructed superiority dissolving into raw animal fear, yet even now her eyes kept darting to Connor with something darker than terror, a resentment that the boy remained composed while she, the educated authority figure, trembled like autumn leaves. The other 2 criminals moved through the hostages with increasing aggression, checking phones, confiscating anything that could become a lifeline to the world beyond these walls, where help felt simultaneously too close and impossibly distant. "Your father isn't coming, Connor," Mrs. Pemberton hissed through clenched teeth, her need to be right warring with her instinct for self-preservation in a battle that revealed everything broken in her soul. "He's probably drunk somewhere, or sleeping off whatever pills get him. Through his pathetic days, because that's what failures do when reality becomes unbearable." Her words cut through the room's tension like acid through silk, and several parents stared at her with expressions caught between horror at her cruelty and desperate hope that antagonizing a child might somehow spare their own families. Connor absorbed the venom without flinching, his eyes tracking movements in the ceiling tiles that no one else seemed to notice. A slight displacement here, a whisper of dust there, the architecture itself becoming complicit in his father's approach. The boy's voice emerged steady and clear, carrying a truth that made Mrs. Pemberton's face flush with sudden, inexplicable doubt. He's unemployed because 12 men died in a valley 7,000 miles from here, and he carried 3 of them out on his back before the helicopter came, Connor said, each word measured and deliberate like stones being placed to build a monument. The gang leader spun toward him, suspicion finally crystallizing into something approaching comprehension, his weapon rising as his survival instinct screamed warnings his arrogance had ignored. Mrs. Pemberton opened her mouth to deliver another cutting remark, her armor of superiority demanding she diminish this moment before it diminished her entire worldview, but the words died unuttered as the ventilation grate dropped silently to the floor. Time seemed to fracture into before and after, the moment suspended like a photograph, capturing the instant everything changed, and in that crystallized second, Connor's father materialized from shadow into substance. The first captor collapsed without a sound, his weapon clattering across linoleum as a figure in dark civilian clothes moved with liquid precision that belonged in movies, rather than their mundane, suburban reality. Connor's dad stood now in the corner, where sightlines intersected and tactical advantage bloomed like deadly flowers, his presence transforming the room's geometry from trap into chessboard, where he'd already calculated 17 moves ahead. Mrs. Pemberton's face drained of color as recognition crashed through her prejudice like a wrecking ball through rice paper. This wasn't the shambling failure she'd imagined, but something forged in fires that consumed lesser men and left behind only essential elements. The second captor never saw the hand that pulled him backward into the shadows behind the overturned desk, his body crumpling with the quiet efficiency of a puppet whose strings had been severed by invisible scissors. Connor's father moved through the classroom like smoke given purpose, his eyes cataloguing exits and angles while his body maintained a deceptive stillness that concealed coiled readiness. Every parent in that room felt the temperature drop as they witnessed capability that existed beyond their comfortable understanding of the world. Mrs. Pemberton's carefully manicured hand rose to her throat, fingers trembling against her pearl necklace as memory supplied context her arrogance had refused. The dismissive parent-teacher conferences, the snide comments about employment status, the condescending suggestions about finding work she'd delivered to this man who'd simply nodded and thanked her for her concern. The gang leader's weapon swung toward this new threat, but his hands betrayed him with a tremor that spoke volumes about the difference between holding power and facing someone who'd been forged in actual warfare. "Gentlemen, my son called me," Connor's dad said, his voice carrying the kind of calm that only comes from having already accepted the worst possible outcomes and finding peace beyond fear's reach. "I suggest we discuss how this ends with everyone walking out of here intact, because the alternative benefits absolutely nobody in this room." His positioning seemed casual until you noticed how it created a human shield between the criminals and the hostages, how his angles of movement had already neutralized 2/3 of their advantage, how his empty hands somehow projected more danger than their weapons. The lead captor's eyes darted between exits, now blocked by tactical considerations he couldn't quite articulate, his bravado eroding like sandcastles before an incoming tide that cared nothing for the structures small men built. Mrs. Pemberton watched this unfold with dawning horror that had nothing to do with the criminals and everything to do with the crushing weight of her own blindness, seeing finally what she'd mocked as weakness revealed as strength she'd never possess. "Your unemployed father," Connor said quietly, his young voice carrying an edge of vindication, tempered by something deeper. Not cruelty, but a kind of sorrowful understanding that his teacher had revealed herself completely. Mrs. Pemberton flinched as though struck, her professional composure shattering like crystal dropped on concrete because the boy's tone held no triumph, only a sadness that she'd needed this extremity to see truth. The gang leader's calculation shifted visibly as he reassessed the tactical landscape, recognizing too late that the scared parents were never the real variable. The real equation had walked in through the ceiling and was already 3 moves ahead, in a game where losing meant everything. Connor's father maintained his position with the patience of someone who'd waited in far more uncomfortable places for far higher stakes, his presence transforming the classroom into a space where amateur violence met professional restraint and found itself wanting. The moment stretched taut as wire between them, pregnant with possibilities that branched like lightning through the charged air. And in that crystallized tension, Mrs. Pemberton finally understood that unemployment was sometimes the scar tissue that forms over wounds too deep for civilian eyes to comprehend. Connor caught his father's eye across the transformed geography of their ordinary classroom, and something passed between them that needed no words, a recognition, an acknowledgement, a confirmation that some lessons can only be taught when the world strips away every pretense. The gang leader's finger tightened on his weapon as desperation began its predictable mathematics, calculating that chaos might offer escape where strategy had failed, his amateur's panic colliding with the veteran's prepared calm. Connor's dad shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, and somehow everyone in that room understood simultaneously that whatever happened next, this man had already decided who would pay the price and who would be protected, his body language writing promises in a vocabulary that transcended spoken language and spoke directly to the primitive brain that understands predator from protector. The negotiation began not with words, but with geometry. Connor's dad positioned himself at an angle that forced the gang leader to choose between watching him and monitoring the exits, a tactical paradox that spoke louder than any threat could. "You've got maybe 4 minutes before tactical teams breach those doors," he said, his voice carrying the conversational tone of someone discussing weather patterns rather than life and death stakes. "But here's what you don't know. I've already signaled them 3 times using patterns you missed, telling them exactly where each of you stands, which weapons you're carrying, and which of you keeps checking that back window." His hand moved to adjust his watch, a gesture so casual that only Connor noticed the specific sequence of movements, the deliberate timing that transformed accessory into communication device. The gang leader's eyes widened as understanding crashed through his adrenaline, realizing he'd been outmaneuvered by signals hidden in plain sight, his control evaporating like morning fog under scrutiny. Mrs. Pemberton watched this chess match unfold with growing comprehension, seeing capabilities that existed beyond her sheltered understanding of what competence actually looked like, her previous judgments crumbling under the weight of demonstrated expertise that required no resume. "Your boy called you with what exactly?" the gang leader demanded, his weapon wavering between targets as desperation infected his decision-making with a poison of panic. Connor's dad smiled without warmth, the expression of someone explaining obvious facts to a slow student. "Military-grade emergency beacon, encrypted frequency, automatically transmitted our exact coordinates and threat assessment to people whose job descriptions you really don't want to learn about firsthand," he replied. It were a hammer blow against the criminal's dissolving confidence. The air itself seemed to thicken with implications as parents processed this revelation, understanding finally that the quiet man they'd dismissed at school functions carried connections that operated in shadows they'd never imagined. Connor felt pride surge through his chest, not because of violence or dominance, but because his father had transformed their family's private pain into purposeful preparation, teaching him that real strength meant protecting others even when the world misunderstood your journey. The gang leader's calculation shifted visibly, his amateur criminal mind colliding with professional military strategy and finding itself completely outmatched in ways he lacked vocabulary to articulate. "You're bluffing," he said, but his voice betrayed him with tremors that spoke of eroding certainty, his grip on the situation dissolving like sand through desperate fingers. Connor's dad tilted his head slightly, another gesture that Connor recognized as communication, another signal in the complex language his father spoke with invisible allies. "In approximately 90 seconds, you'll hear a distinctive triple knock on that door," he said, pointing without looking. "That'll be your last chance to put down weapons and walk out of here with futures that don't involve federal prosecution." The specificity of his prediction carried more weight than any threat, because it demonstrated knowledge that transformed hope into tactical reality, turning the criminal's advantage into liability through nothing more than preparation and skill. Mrs. Pemberton's hand still trembled against her throat, but now her expression held something beyond fear, a dawning recognition that her simple-town assumptions had blinded her to complexity that existed right beneath her condescending gaze. Then, impossibly, exactly 90 seconds later, 3 precise knocks echoed through the classroom door, and the gang leader's weapon clattered to the floor as his nerve finally shattered completely. The 3 knocks hung in the air like thunder, and Mrs. Pemberton's survival instincts finally overwhelmed her practiced superiority. She lunged toward the door with the panicked conviction of someone mistaking rescue for immediate salvation, her heels clicking against tile in a desperate rhythm that shattered tactical silence. "Wait, don't," Connor's dad started, but terror had already hijacked her reasoning, transforming a controlled situation into cascading chaos that professionals spend careers learning to prevent. The gang leader's partner, jittery with the chemical courage of someone whose judgment had been compromised hours before this operation began, swung his weapon toward the sudden movement with the hair-trigger reflexes of amateur panic, time fractured into those crystalline fragments where trained minds process variables that others experience as blur. Connor's dad calculated angles, velocities, consequences, and costs in the microsecond before his body launched across the space between intention and catastrophe. His shoulder connected with Mrs. Pemberton's frame in a controlled collision that looked violent but was precisely calibrated to redirect without injuring, sending her sprawling safely behind her overturned desk while simultaneously positioning himself between her body and the weapon, now tracking empty air. The sharp crack of a gunshot split reality, followed immediately by the heavier sound of Connor's dad's tactical boot connecting with the shooter's wrist, disarming him with efficiency that spoke of 10,000 repetitions burned into muscle memory. Mrs. Pemberton lay gasping on cold linoleum, alive because the man she'd spent months belittling had just valued her life more than his own. Safety, a lesson delivered not through words, but through action that bypassed intellect and struck directly at the core of conscience. "Stay down and stay quiet," Connor's dad commanded, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who'd earned the right to give life or death instructions without debate or discussion. Blood seeped through his sleeve where the bullet had grazed rather than penetrated, a wound he registered with the detached acknowledgement of someone cataloguing minor inconveniences during more pressing operations. The door burst open as tactical teams flooded the room with practiced precision, their movements choreographed through training that transformed chaos into controlled resolution within heartbeats. Connor watched his father coordinate with hand signals while simultaneously applying pressure to his own wound, multitasking with the casual competence that defined his entire approach to crisis. Mrs. Pemberton's eyes remained locked on the man she'd called worthless, watching him bleed from protecting her. Despite every cruel word she'd weaponized against his child, the gangs were subdued with efficient professionalism, zip-tied and extracted, while medics swarmed toward Connor's dad, who waved them first toward hostages, with priorities that placed others ahead of himself even now. In that moment, bleeding and exhausted, he taught everyone in that room more about character than any lesson plan could ever contain. The medic finished wrapping Connor's dad's arm when the boy approached, trembling not from fear anymore, but from the weight of everything he'd witnessed, and his father pulled him close with his good arm, holding him in silence that spoke louder than any reassurance. Mrs. Pemberton remained seated against the wall, watching father and son with eyes that had been forcibly opened, her entire worldview crumbling like sandcastles against an incoming tide of humbling truth. "You want to know why I don't talk about what I did?" Connor's dad finally spoke, his voice carrying across the emptying room to include everyone still present, including the teacher who demanded those answers with such cruel insistence. He looked down at Connor with an expression that mixed profound love and equally profound sorrow, the face of a man who'd seen too much but refused to let darkness define him. "I had brothers once, men who would have done exactly what I just did, except they never got the chance to come home and hold their own kids like this." The raw vulnerability in his words stripped away every pretense, every wall, leaving only human truth that resonated in the marrow of everyone listening. Connor felt his father's heart beating steady and strong, the rhythm of survival that had carried him through battles nobody in this school could begin to imagine. There was one mission. Can't tell you where, can't tell you when, but we lost 3 good men because someone made a panicked decision, just like tonight, he continued, his gaze finding Mrs. Pemberton's with an intensity that wasn't accusation, but invitation to understand. "My team leader, Marcus, threw himself on a grenade that shouldn't have been there if protocols had been followed, and he saved 12 lives, including mine, by making himself the cost." The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as his voice thickened with emotion he'd held back for years, finally releasing it in this unlikely confessional, surrounded by overturned furniture and fading adrenaline. "I came home with his dog tags and a mind that wouldn't stop replaying that moment, wondering why I survived when better men didn't, questioning whether I deserved this second chance." Connor squeezed his father tighter, understanding now why some nights his dad sat alone in darkness, wrestling with invisible enemies that no tactical skill could defeat. "I chose this quiet life, this unemployment that looked so shameful to some, because I needed to heal enough to be the father my son deserves, the father Marcus never got to become. Every day I don't work a normal job, I'm actually fighting the hardest battle of my life, learning to live with what I've seen, honoring what I've lost, and trying to teach my son that real strength isn't about violence or dominance," he said, his words landing like stones in still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond this moment. The room had gone completely silent except for Mrs. Pemberton's quiet sobbing, the sound of a woman confronting the magnitude of her own cruelty reflected back through a mirror she couldn't escape. Connor looked up at his father with eyes shining with tears and pride intermingled, seeing him fully for perhaps the first time, understanding that heroism wore many faces and fought many wars. "You've been strong through everything they said about us, Connor, and that's the legacy Marcus would want, not vengeance, not bitterness, but the courage to remain kind even when the world isn't kind to you." His father's voice broke slightly on those final words, and in that breaking, something fundamental healed between them, a bond forged stronger through shared vulnerability than triumph ever could. The lesson transcended the violence that had preceded it, transforming trauma into teaching that would echo through young Connor's entire life ahead. Mrs. Pemberton rose unsteadily, her carefully constructed armor of superiority completely shattered, and she moved toward them with hesitant steps of someone approaching sacred ground they'd previously desecrated through ignorance. She opened her mouth twice before words finally emerged, small and fractured and achingly human. "I had no right. I'm so sorry. I'm so deeply sorry." Connor's dad met her gaze with the steady compassion of someone who'd learned that holding grudges was just another form of carrying unnecessary weight into an already heavy future. "We all fight battles others can't see, Mrs. Pemberton," he said gently, extending the grace she hadn't earned, but desperately needed, demonstrating for his son what true strength looked like in its most refined form. In that exchange, witnessed by Connor and the few remaining souls in that transformed classroom, forgiveness became more than abstract concept. It became visceral reality, proof that even the deepest wounds could begin healing when met with courage that chose understanding over condemnation. The principal's office felt smaller than its actual dimensions as Connor's dad closed the door behind them, leaving Mrs. Pemberton alone with the man whose life she'd so carelessly judged. The fluorescent bulb overhead, casting harsh shadows that seemed to illuminate every hidden corner of unspoken truth. She stood with her back against the bookshelf, arms wrapped protectively around herself, while he remained near the door, not blocking it, but present in a way that commanded the space without aggression. "You want to know why I really wasn't working," he began, his voice stripped of the adrenaline that had carried him through the crisis, now revealing the exhaustion underneath, the bone-deep weariness of someone who'd been fighting invisible wars long after the visible ones ended. His hands, still steady despite everything, pulled a worn photograph from his wallet. 5 men in tactical gear, arms around each other, alive and whole in a moment frozen before everything shattered. "After Marcus died, after we lost the others, I came home to my son and couldn't remember how to be human anymore. Couldn't sleep without seeing their faces. Couldn't function without checking every corner for threats that weren't there." She watched him with widening eyes as understanding began penetrating the defensive walls she'd built around her own pain, recognizing in his confession the shadow of something terrifyingly familiar. "The Veterans Affairs Office became my full-time job. PTSD treatment 3 times weekly, grief counseling, learning to separate past from present so I wouldn't destroy the one good thing I had left." His voice cracked slightly as he continued, "The vulnerability more devastating than any display of tactical prowess could ever be. Each word a piece of armor removed to show the wounds beneath. I sat in circles with men who'd survived impossible things, and we cried together because that's what healing actually looks like. Not strength, not stoicism, but the courage to admit you're broken and need help, putting yourself back together." Mrs. Pemberton's own tears began flowing freely now, not the shocked sobbing from before, but something deeper, something that had been dammed up for decades behind her own carefully maintained facade of control. "My father left when I was Connor's age," she whispered, the confession torn from some buried place she'd never allowed anyone to access, her voice shaking with the weight of carrying that abandonment alone for so many years. "He said he couldn't handle the responsibility, that we were holding him back, and I've spent my entire life trying to prove I didn't need anyone, that I was strong enough, successful enough, controlled enough to never be abandoned again." The parallel hung between them like a bridge across seemingly impossible distance. 2 people wounded by different wars but bearing remarkably similar scars. Recognition dawning that cruelty often springs from unhealed, pain-seeking company in its misery. "When I saw Connor's paperwork listing you as unemployed, something vicious in me wanted him to feel what I felt. Wanted to prove that fathers fail, that depending on anyone makes you vulnerable," she continued, her words tumbling out in confession that had waited decades for safe harbor. The shame in her expression was absolute, the recognition of having weaponized her own trauma against an innocent child whose only crime was loving his father despite the world's judgment. Connor's dad moved slowly, deliberately, closing the distance between them with the careful approach of someone who understood how fragile this moment was, how easily defensive Walls could slam back into place if he moved too quickly or spoke too harshly. "You couldn't have known," he said simply, extending the same grace he'd shown in the classroom, but now with deeper context, choosing to see her not as enemy but as fellow casualty of life's battles, someone who'd been fighting alone for far too long. His hand extended, in a gesture that was somehow both acceptance and absolution, offering connection where judgment would have been easier and perhaps more satisfying. But now you do know, and what you do with that knowledge, that's where real character shows itself, where we all get to choose who we become after the crisis passes and consequences arrive. Mrs. Pemberton took his offered hand with trembling fingers, feeling in that simple contact the permission she'd never granted herself to be less than perfect, to acknowledge failure without it defining her entirely, to begin the terrifying work of examining how her pain had poisoned her interactions with others. "I'll spend the rest of my career making this right," she promised, the words carrying the weight of genuine commitment rather than empty platitude, her eyes meeting his with newfound clarity, born from having her illusions stripped away by the very person she'd most wronged. In that small office, with the sounds of emergency vehicles fading outside and the evidence of violence still being processed down the hall, two broken people found unexpected common ground, not in their wounds, but in their willingness to finally acknowledge them, to choose healing over hiding, to transform their pain into purpose rather than letting it transform them into perpetrators of the same cycles that had damaged them. The door opened to reveal Connor waiting anxiously outside, and his father turned to include him in this moment, knowing that witnessing grace in action would teach his son more than any lecture about forgiveness ever could. Connor stood in the doorway watching his father extend not just his hand, but something far more precious, the kind of mercy that costs something. To give, the kind that recognizes shared humanity even when someone has caused deep harm, and the boy understood in that crystalline moment that true strength wasn't about never being hurt, but about refusing to let that hurt turn you into someone who hurts others. Mrs. Pemberton's shoulders shook as she accepted the offered grace, her perfectly maintained composure finally crumbling to reveal the frightened girl who'd been hiding behind authority and cruelty for 30 years, using her position to replay the abandonment that had defined her life, projecting onto innocent children the betrayal she'd never processed or healed. "I don't deserve this," she whispered through tears that washed away years of carefully applied armor, her voice breaking on each syllable as decades of unacknowledged pain found expression in the presence of someone who understood that suffering doesn't excuse harm, but does explain it. Connor's dad knelt to his son's level, drawing him into the moment rather than shielding him from it, understanding that witnessing forgiveness in action would shape his character more profoundly than any lecture about morality ever could, teaching him that cycles of pain only end when someone chooses to absorb the hurt rather than passing it forward. "Connor, Mrs. Pemberton made mistakes that hurt you, hurt us both, but she made them from a place of her own. Pain she didn't know how to heal, so it leaked out onto others," he explained, his hand gentle on his son's shoulder while his eyes held both teacher and child in a circle of difficult truth. The boy looked at his teacher with eyes that held neither hatred nor fear, but something closer to understanding, recognition that the adult who'd mocked him was herself a wounded child who'd never been shown the path toward healing, never been offered the grace she now received. "My dad taught me that holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to get sick," Connor said quietly. The wisdom beyond his years earned through watching his father fight invisible battles. With courage, rather than bitterness, processing trauma through treatment rather than projection. Mrs. Pemberton dropped to her knees, bringing herself to the child's level in a gesture of equality rather than authority, her hand reaching tentatively toward the boy she'd humiliated, as if seeking permission for contact she no longer presumed to deserve. I'm so sorry, Connor. Those words were never about you, never about your father. They were about ghosts I've been running from my whole life, and I let them chase you instead, she confessed, her apology raw and complete, offering no excuses while providing context that transformed cruelty from inexplicable to tragically understandable. The three of them stood together in that small office where judgment had given way to mercy, where the hard work of actual transformation began not with punishment, but with the far more difficult path of accountability, forgiveness, and the mutual recognition that everyone carries invisible wounds that shape how they move through the world. Connor reached out and took his teacher's hand, his small fingers closing around hers in a gesture that released her from the prison of her shame, while simultaneously holding her responsible for different choices moving forward. And his father's eyes shone with pride, knowing his son had learned the most important lesson, that breaking cycles of pain requires someone brave enough to choose differently. The autumn sunlight streamed through the gymnasium windows 6 weeks later as the entire school gathered in bleacher rows that rose like amphitheater seating, creating an intimacy unusual for assemblies that typically felt perfunctory and forgettable. Connor sat in the front row beside his father, watching Mrs. Pemberton at the podium, introducing the guest speaker with words that trembled between professional composure and personal testimony, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd been fundamentally altered by events she could barely comprehend. Principal Davidson watched from the side stage with folded hands, having witnessed a transformation in his veteran teacher that he'd stopped believing possible after 3 decades of rigid authoritarianism. Her recent vulnerability in faculty meetings, revealing dimensions of humanity her colleagues had never suspected existed. The air felt charged with anticipation as students whispered questions about the mysterious night when criminals invaded their parent conference, and something extraordinary happened in the ordinary corridors of Lincoln Elementary. Stories filtered through childhood imagination until fact and legend merged into schoolyard mythology. Connor's dad approached the microphone with the same quiet confidence he'd shown in the ventilation shaft. Above armed criminals, his posture relaxed yet purposeful, carrying himself with the bearing of someone who'd faced genuine danger and returned transformed rather than diminished. Most of you know me as Connor's dad, the guy who picks him up in the old truck, who doesn't wear a suit to school events, who some people assumed had nothing important to do. He began, his words landing without accusation, yet acknowledging the judgments that had been made, the assumptions about worth measured in visible success. Behind him, Mrs. Pemberton closed her eyes as his gentle rebuke found its mark, not in her alone, but in the collective consciousness of a community that had confused external markers with internal value, mistaken quiet dignity for absence of significance. What you couldn't see were the battles I was fighting every single day. Not against enemies overseas anymore, but against memories that ambushed me in grocery store aisles, against survivors' guilt that whispered I didn't deserve the peaceful life my brothers in arms would never experience, against wounds that don't bleed but hurt just as deeply. He moved from behind the podium, closing the distance between speaker and audience, transforming lecture into conversation, his vulnerability creating safety for others to acknowledge their own hidden struggles. I spent 20 years as a Navy SEAL, and in one terrible mission, I lost 7 teammates who were more than friends. They were family, brothers who trusted me with their lives, and I came home when they didn't. His voice caught on the words, the emotion raw and undefended, modeling for young audiences that strength includes the capacity to grieve openly. The gymnasium had fallen into absolute silence. 500 students and teachers holding collective breath as this man they'd dismissed revealed depths of sacrifice they'd never considered. His story recontextualizing the judgment, the mockery, the casual cruelty that had been directed toward him and his son. Connor watched his classmates' faces transform as understanding replaced assumption. As the invisible became visible, as their narrow definitions of heroism and success expanded to include battles fought in therapy offices and kitchen tables at 3 in the morning when nightmares refused mercy. So when my son tells you his dad is home, unemployed, working on himself, he's not making excuses. He's telling you, I'm engaged in the most important mission of my life, which is healing enough to be the father he deserves, present enough to teach him that asking for help is courage, not weakness, he concluded, his hand finding Connor's shoulder as the boy joined him on stage, their unity a testimony more powerful than any words could express. The applause began slowly. Then, built into something more than appreciation, it was recognition, apology, commitment to seeing beyond surfaces, and Mrs. Pemberton led the standing ovation with tears streaming down her face, her redemption written in every person rising to honor the man she'd once mocked, and the countless invisible warriors fighting battles the world refuses to acknowledge. What hidden battles might the people around you be fighting that you've never thought to see? Subscribe to witness more stories that challenge how we judge strength and measure worth.